The acrid smoke clawed at my nostrils, thick and unrelenting, as if the world itself exhaled only ruin. Beneath the ochre haze, the fires of the city cast a jaundiced light across the shattered columns of the fortress-monastery. The air was heavy, sticky with ash and the tang of charred flesh. My gauntlet hands itched to touch, to grasp, yet the heat forced me back, each step a measured negotiation with the burning debris underfoot. Around me, the distant wails of dying men echoed like a distorted hymn. Somewhere above, a flaring sun fought to pierce the smog, its light refracted in 1,000 broken lenses, a reminder that even in the void of despair, the Imperium's presence lingered. I inhaled, tasting the sharp bite of metal and ozone, and reminded myself of the vigil. It was our duty, our sacred right to endure, to stand against the tide that threatened to drown us. I tightened the clasps of my armor, feeling the cold bite of ceramite against flesh. Every panel bore the scars of countless engagements, gouges from bolter fire, etchings of chapter insignias, prayers scratched into the steel by trembling hands. Even in silence, the armor seemed to whisper its history, murmurs of brotherhood and blood, each telling me that surrender was not an option. Yet, in the marrow of my mind, the weight of mortality pressed insistently, a question that dared to shadow my faith. Footfalls echoed from the hollowed hallways behind me. I knew the sound. Brother Malthus, the chaplain, returning from the crypts with the bones of those fallen. He never spoke unless summoned, but the rhythm of his gait was sermon enough, a cadence of solemnity that demanded contemplation. "We cannot falter, brother," he murmured without looking, his voice swallowed by the smog. I nodded, though his eyes never met mine. There was no need. The understanding passed in silence, a communion of men forged in ritual and fire. The first hours of the siege had been merciless. I watched the sky darken as enemy ordnance tore through the outer bastions, the concussive thuds resonating through my chest like the heartbeat of a dying god. I had learned to reconcile the smell of ozone with that of burning oil, to find rhythm in the chaos. Still, my mind recoiled at the carnage, at the unholy geometry of mutilated bodies strewn with liturgical precision. Each death was a lesson, each scream a sermon, yet the dread seeped into my thoughts like water into stone. Was it weakness to notice? Or was it truth, an admission that even angels of death bore the stains of fear? I approached the central altar, where a single candle flickered stubbornly against the storm of smoke and shadow. Its flame danced, casting grotesque figures on the walls, mocking and reverent simultaneously. Kneeling, I traced the sigil etched into the stone, fingers cold but steady. "Omnicia preserve us," I whispered, the words barely audible over the din. I felt the familiar tension of ritual wrapping around me, a temporary sanctuary against the encroaching madness. The act was mechanical yet sacred. Each gesture was a tether to purpose, each breath a defiance of the void pressing against my mind. The shadows on the walls writhed, and I wondered if they were real or merely the first betrayals of a fatigued psyche. My thoughts drifted to the beginning of our chapter's fall. How swiftly the ground had shifted beneath our feet. Once, the fortress had been a monument to unyielding will, its halls vibrant with the life of our brothers. Now, silence claimed every corridor, punctuated only by the clamor of distant artillery. Memories flickered, laughter in the barracks, the metallic tang of fresh oaths, the scent of oil and incense mixed in the forges. I could almost hear the voices, almost touch the banners that had flown proudly. Each recollection, however, was a dagger, a reminder of what we had lost, of the futility that now shadowed our vigilance. A sudden tremor ran through the floor. Dust cascaded from the arches above, and the candle flickered violently. My mind seized the moment, interpreting it as both warning and revelation. "The Emperor watches," I whispered to the emptiness, though doubt tainted the declaration. What was his watch but silent witness to slaughter? The ritual demanded faith, but my thoughts were fractured. I saw the faces of the fallen, the hollow gaze of those who had perished in the last defense. And yet, I pressed on, moving toward the armory, drawing strength from repetition, from the cold steel of bolters and blades. Each weapon was a promise, a fragment of certainty in a world unraveling. Brother Malthus's return was punctuated by the clang of the chapel doors, the metallic resonance splitting the haze. "We endure," he said simply. There was no elaboration. It was not needed. I nodded, gripping the haft of my axe. The shadows shifted again, a subtle whisper against the walls. I imagined the enemy waiting, always waiting, their presence a constant, silent torment. The air around us thickened, carrying the scent of iron and decay. My heart hammered in cadence with the ritual drums that seemed to echo only in my head. I wondered if this was the edge of reason or the beginning of transcendence. Perhaps they were indistinguishable here. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement beyond the broken windows, a distortion in the smoke. A reminder that the siege had not ceased, that our vigil was yet demanded. The flame of the candle shivered in acknowledgement, shadows curling to meet it. I inhaled, tasting the bitter ash, and felt the weight of inevitability settle in my chest. Resistance was the first act, but acceptance whispered in the spaces between thoughts, an insidious companion. My fingers tightened around the haft of my axe, ceremonial yet lethal, ready for whatever came through the haze. The vigil had begun, and we would stand, though the ground beneath us crumbled and the heavens themselves seemed to mourn. I stepped forward into the dim corridor beyond the chapel, the smell of smoke and sweat filling my lungs, the echo of Malthus's footsteps beside me, and felt the first shiver of something both terrifying and sacred. The fortress moaned as if alive, aware of our intent, and I realized that the journey ahead was not merely through stone and flame, but through the landscape of my own fractured mind. Each step carried the weight of eternity, each breath a question of endurance. And still we walked. The vigil had begun. The air was colder here, as if the fortress itself exhaled despair. Frost clung to the fractured stone, a bitter contrast to the heat of the fires behind me. I could taste the iron in the wind, a metallic tang that mixed with the ever-present ash, sharp on my tongue. Each step echoed hollowly against walls that had once resounded with drills, prayers, and the laughter of my brothers. Now, silence reigned, punctuated by the occasional groan of stressed beams or the distant rumble of artillery. Light was a stranger here. Flickers of lumens from damaged conduits barely penetrated the gloom. Shadows twisted unnaturally, as if mocking my resolve, and the chills seeped past ceramite, gnawing at flesh I had long considered impervious. I traced my fingers along the cold stone, feeling the etched glyphs of the chapter's triumphs. The carvings were worn, dulled by centuries, yet their intent remained potent. Remembrance, duty, eternal vigilance. Each sigil demanded reflection. I whispered the prayers aloud, not expecting reply, but needing the cadence of ritual to anchor my mind. The echoes returned fragmented, as if the walls themselves were unsure of their faith. I thought of Brother Varus, fallen in the last counterstrike, and the stubborn dignity with which he had held the line. Death had been patient, systematic, and absolute. To honor it was not to defy despair, but to recognize it, to carry it like a banner stitched into one's soul. Movement in the darkness drew my gaze. A rat, twisted, unnatural, formatted with ash, scurried across the hallway. The sight should have been trivial, yet it sparked a fleeting reflection. Life persisted even amidst ruin, stubbornly, defiantly. I wondered whether my persistence was similarly pathetic or sacred. The line between defiance and folly had thinned, worn by the unrelenting passage of time and battle. I reached the armory, the familiar scent of oiled steel and machine spirits greeting me with a cold familiarity. Bolters, axes, and relic blades gleamed faintly under the dim lights, reminders that ritual and combat were inseparable. Each weapon seemed to murmur the same question: will you uphold the vigil, even as the world decays around you? I paused at the rack of ceremonial daggers, hands hovering over the hilts. Each one was more than a tool of war. It was a testament to the chapter's endurance, a vessel of memory and faith. I ran a thumb along one blade, feeling the cold perfection of craftsmanship and the faint etching of a prayer in High Gothic. Ritual demanded repetition, discipline, and acceptance. And yet, I felt the first stirrings of doubt. Was my adherence a defiance of despair, or merely a hollow echo of what once was? The weight of centuries pressed down, and I found no solace in tradition alone. The vigil required more than motion. It required conviction, and conviction was tested in the shadow of inevitability. I heard the distant chant of Malthus again, carried faintly through collapsed corridors. His voice, grave and unwavering, recited the litany of the fallen. I imagined him walking amidst the ruins, the hem of his robes trailing ash. I whispered along with him, syllables repeating mechanically at first, then with growing awareness. Each word struck a chord of clarity and unease. The chapter was dying, yet the faith persisted. Was devotion measured by survival or by the refusal to abandon duty? My mind twisted these questions over and over, a relentless litany that rivaled his own. I felt the corners of my reason fray, the edges of fear pressing into the ritual spaces of my mind. A sudden tremor ran through the floor, small yet insistent, like the pulse of a hidden predator. Dust cascaded from the ceilings, settling on the blades and icons, whispering the fragility of our sanctuary. I braced against a column, hearing the distant echoes of enemy engines hammering the outer walls. My thoughts fractured. Each sound was a herald of death, each echo a reminder of the vigil's fragility. And yet, I stood, steadying my breathing, letting the ritual guide me. The bolter in my hands felt alive, resonating with the pulse of the chapter itself. I imagined the spirits of my brothers inhabiting the steel, their courage lending weight to my arms. I could almost hear their voices, calling me to action, demanding that I endure. My meditation was interrupted by a sudden wail, distant but intimate, carried through cracks and hollow halls. It might have been a survivor or something else. My armor creaked as I pivoted, instincts sharpened by years of battle. The air seemed to thicken, carrying the faint, pungent tang of corruption. I hesitated. Was this the enemy, or the first whispers of something darker, something insidious seeping through the fractures of reality? I inhaled, tasting ash and ozone, and reminded myself, fear was a companion, not a master. My hands gripped the hilts tighter, knuckles white inside the gauntlets. I whispered a prayer, asking for clarity and the strength to endure, though part of me wondered whether prayers were truly answered or merely echoes of desperation. I descended into the lower corridors, where the shadows pooled like liquid, gathering in corners and niches. The temperature dropped, biting through the layered armor, pressing me inward. The walls here were scarred with claw marks and burn patterns, telling a story of resistance and futility. I traced them lightly, noting the repeated symbols of the chapter, the sigils of faith carved hurriedly by trembling hands. I recognized the pattern, a lineage of perseverance, each mark a testament that we had stood, though every victory had been Pyrrhic. My mind flickered between pride and despair, and I wondered whether the act of standing was itself an acknowledgement of inevitable loss. Perhaps the vigil was less about triumph and more about the quiet courage to face the unrelenting void. Finally, I paused in a chamber partially collapsed by bombardment. Candles flickered despite the winds that blew ash and dust, their flames defying entropy. I knelt and traced the outline of a fallen brother's visage etched into the floor, a silent memorial, ritualized in humility and sorrow. The act grounded me, a fleeting sense of stability amid chaos. I felt the chapter's history weigh upon me, a tide of memory, ritual, and unspoken expectation. And yet, the future remained uncertain, a darkness stretching beyond comprehension. I rose, bolter in hand, breath shallow, and whispered into the encroaching gloom. We endure, not for victory, but because we must. The shadows around me shifted, and I knew the vigil demanded the next step. The path forward was inevitable, and I would follow it, whether it led to salvation or oblivion. The stench of decay was heavier here, thicker than ash or smoke, clinging to my armor and saturating the air. It was the scent of time, of what had been lost and never reclaimed. The hallways beneath the fortress seemed to breathe, exhaling memories of fallen brothers, whispers of prayers twisted by death. The walls, once vibrant with banners and frescoes, now wore a sullen patina of soot and neglect. Each step I took echoed like a drumbeat in a tomb, a measured cadence of inevitability. The chill cut deeper here, as if the stones themselves had absorbed grief and rendered it tangible, pressing against my ceramite and seeping into the marrow of my bones. I inhaled the bitter, coppery tang of iron and blood, letting it remind me that life persisted even in ruins. I paused before a shattered reliquary, the fragments of sacred icons scattered across the floor. The sanctity of the space was compromised, but not yet extinguished. I knelt, brushing away debris with gloved hands, uncovering a fragment of a scroll etched with the chapter's history. Each letter was a testament, a memory captured in ritualistic precision. I whispered the words aloud, letting the syllables roll over my tongue, tasting the weight of centuries. And yet, with every recitation, a creeping doubt burrowed into my mind. What did endurance mean when the walls themselves were surrendering, when death pressed ever closer, and when the enemy's presence was a constant, suffocating shadow? A faint murmur caught my attention, a sound almost imperceptible beneath the groan of the fortress. I strained to hear, muscles coiled beneath the ceramite. It was not the enemy, not yet, but the resonance of something older, something patient. The air shimmered faintly, carrying the faint scent of ozone, bitter and acrid, laced with something else, something unholy. I tightened my grip on the bolter, the metal cool beneath my palms, a reminder of sacred duty and iron resolve. My mind swirled with questions that had no answers. Was faith enough when the void pressed close? Was ritual a shield, or merely a distraction from inevitable oblivion? The fortress whispered its own truths, neither comforting nor condemning, only insisting that I continue, step by step, echo by echo. I pressed forward, descending deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, guided by the soft flicker of damaged lumens and the occasional candle placed by a brother too fatigued to reach the chapel. The shadows here seemed alive, coiling and twisting in ways that defied geometry, and the darkness carried a weight that threatened to bend perception. I felt the edges of my thoughts fray, each step demanding discipline, each breath a battle against despair. I recited litanies under my breath, syllables straining against the oppressive atmosphere, letting ritual shape my will. And still, the whispers lingered, ever present, hints of mockery in the silence. I was not alone in this emptiness. The fallen haunted the spaces between heartbeats, and I could not tell whether they were guiding me or luring me into madness. I came upon a chamber where the walls were blackened with scorch marks, the floor littered with fragments of the faithful. Bones protruded through armor, shattered in places that spoke of desperation more than technique. I knelt among them, hands trembling despite my training, and traced the faces I had known, brothers, heroes, martyrs. Each gaze bore a silent accusation. We endure, yet the cost is more than flesh and ceramite. I whispered their names, each one a lifeline to memory, each one a dagger in the heart. The room was quiet, but the air vibrated with the resonance of their absence, a chorus of loss that seemed to merge with the very walls. I wondered how long one could bear this communion of death before the mind cracked, before the whispers became commands. A sudden tremor shook the chamber, dust cascading from the ceiling in fine clouds. I rose, bolter at the ready, sensing the predatory patience of the enemy, or perhaps of something else entirely. The temperature dropped further, frost forming along the edges of the armor, biting at my joints. The ritual of breathing became a conscious act, each inhale and exhale a prayer to the Omniscia, to the Emperor, to whatever powers still lingered in this place. I recited the creed of vigilance, the words forming armor for my mind, shielding me from encroaching despair. Yet, I could not deny the creeping sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracing my movements, analyzing my devotion, questioning my resolve. I moved through the corridors methodically, noting the remnants of past defenses, scorch marks, bolter casings, shattered doors twisted by siege engines. The ghosts of strategy and discipline lingered in the architecture, reminders that even the mightiest efforts were fragile. My reflection upon these ruins brought no comfort, only clarity. The chapter was failing, its legacy imperiled, yet my duty remained. Ritual became my compass, the repetition of sacred gestures grounding me in purpose, even as the weight of inevitability pressed harder with each step. I considered the thin line between resilience and obstinacy, and I chose to walk it regardless, bolter in hand, heart racing, mind vigilant. The corridors opened into an antechamber where the remnants of a shrine still stood, faintly illuminated by failing lumens. I knelt before the altar, hands clasped over the relic, and felt the presence of the fallen titan around me, their silence as demanding as any prayer. I whispered the litany of endurance, letting the words fill the void, and for a moment, the weight of despair seemed suspended. Yet the shadows moved differently now, curling like smoke around my mind, hinting at forces that respected neither flesh nor faith. I could feel the vigil stretching, the chapter's identity pressing into me, merging with my consciousness, demanding that I continue despite the gnawing knowledge that nothing in this fortress would remain. I rose, bolter in hand, senses sharpened, and felt the oppressive presence of inevitability pressing closer. The fortress moaned, responding to unseen forces, to the ghosts of the fallen, and to the weight of duty. I took a steadying breath, tasting ash and iron, feeling the cold of ceramite through my skin, and whispered a vow. We endure, even as the shadows grow and the world crumbles. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with peril both seen and unseen, yet the vigil demanded movement. I stepped into the darkness beyond, the weight of history and expectation pressing against me, and knew the journey through despair had only just begun. The corridors were hollow, and silence had settled like dust, thick and suffocating. I moved slowly, each step a careful negotiation with stones scarred by centuries of siege and devotion. The faint light from fractured lumens cast fractured reflections on the walls, making the shadows appear alive, curling and twisting with a subtle malevolence. I inhaled the cold, metallic air, tasting the faint tang of decay beneath the pervasive ash. Every breath felt deliberate, as if inhaling too quickly might disturb something ancient and watchful. The silence was not empty. It hummed with expectation, with remembrance, with accusation. It pressed on my chest, heavy as ceramite, reminding me of the fragility of our vigil. I paused before a massive, splintered door, the once polished metal now dulled and etched with the marks of desperate combat. A faint scent of burning incense lingered, stubborn against the pervasive odor of decay. I traced my fingers over the cold surface, feeling the indentations where sigils of faith had been scratched into the steel, prayers left behind by brothers whose voices were now silent. The ritual demanded recognition of their effort, acknowledgement of their sacrifice. Yet my mind recoiled from the enormity of it. Were we surviving, or merely prolonging the inevitable? Each mark, each scratch, each whisper etched into memory pressed upon me with unbearable weight. Footsteps echoed faintly behind me. I knew without turning that it was Brother Kale, moving with deliberate caution, his ceramite armor creaking softly. He never spoke unnecessarily, yet his presence was an affirmation. We endure. I heard him murmur a brief litany, the words low and reverent. I repeated them under my breath, letting rhythm and repetition anchor my mind. Even as I recited, the silence seemed to expand, filling the spaces between syllables, wrapping around my consciousness like a shroud. The fortress, these empty halls, and the shadows between demanded a careful attention to every movement, every thought, every prayer. I descended a stairwell, the steps uneven, fractured from bombardment, each one threatening to collapse beneath weight. My gauntlet hands gripped the rail, feeling the jagged edges bite through ceramite. The air here was colder, thicker, imbued with the smell of mold and rot, and a faint undertone that suggested corruption, subtle but unmistakable. The presence of the enemy, or perhaps forces older and stranger than any foe I had faced, was implied rather than seen. Each step down was a negotiation with instinct, with reason, with ritualized discipline, reminding me that vigilance was not merely physical but mental, spiritual, existential. A sudden gust of air stirred a fallen banner at the bottom of the stairs. The fabric, once vibrant with chapter colors, was now blackened and brittle, its threads whispering in the windless corridor. I approached it, touching the remnants, feeling the texture of devotion worn thin by attrition and battle. The banner carried the echoes of oaths, the weight of lives committed to duty, and the lingering question, was our perseverance an act of piety or of folly? I folded the tattered remnant, setting it reverently aside, allowing ritual to dictate the manner of its handling, but my mind lingered on the impermanence of all things. The deeper I moved into the fortress, the more the silence transformed, becoming a living presence. It was oppressive yet instructive, a companion that demanded introspection, a mirror reflecting my own doubts and fears. I paused in a chamber partially intact, where shattered pews bore the carvings of generations. I ran my hands over the splintered wood, feeling the grooves of names etched into it, the prayers inscribed by brothers long dead. Each touch was a communion, a conversation with ghosts, and yet it also provoked reflection. How much of our faith was inherited inertia, and how much was conscious, deliberate conviction? The question gnawed at the edges of my ritual, tempting me with the idea of surrender, of silent acquiescence to despair. I lit a candle, the flame trembling but persistent, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I felt the draft of unseen currents, as though the fortress exhaled around me, carrying whispers that were almost intelligible. I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of smoke and wax, and let my mind trace the contours of the chapter's history. Battles won and lost, vows made and broken, sacrifices counted and uncounted. The narrative of our order was embedded in every stone, every sigil, every drop of blood spilled. I allowed the ritual to fill me, to steady the tremor in my soul, but beneath it lingered the awareness of mortality, of inevitable failure. A distant clanging reverberated through the halls, irregular yet purposeful. My instincts surged. The enemy pressed, or perhaps it was the fortress itself signaling the decay of its integrity. I adjusted the bolter on my shoulder, feeling the reassuring weight of steel and machine spirit. I whispered a short prayer, asking for clarity, for vigilance, for endurance, though part of me recognized the futility of words. Faith was a weapon as necessary as any blade, yet it could not shield us from inevitability. Still, I stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, conscious of the weight of history pressing against me, demanding movement, demanding observation, demanding presence. The silence shifted as I entered the inner sanctum, the air thickening with anticipation. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, merging with the remnants of architectural grandeur, and I felt the weight of countless eyes, some real, some imagined, upon me. I whispered to the empty chamber, reciting a fragment of the Creed of Vigilance, allowing ritual to carve a path through my mind. The fortress seemed to respond, groaning faintly under some unseen pressure, as if acknowledging my endurance while reminding me of its fragility. I clenched my fists, tasting the metallic tang of tension, and stepped deeper into the gloom, knowing the path ahead would demand more than ritual, more than faith. It would demand confrontation with the abyss itself. Each step echoed like a heartbeat in the cathedral of silence, carrying me toward the next act of vigilance, toward the next confrontation with the inevitable. I inhaled, feeling the cold settle into my bones, and whispered, "The vigil continues, even as the fortress moans, even as the shadows grow." I moved forward, guided by ritual, propelled by duty, and aware that the weight of silence was not an enemy. It was the measure of our endurance, the shadow of our chapter, and the first harbinger of what was to come. The air smelled of soot and iron, a constant reminder that death had already passed through these halls. Every breath drew ash into my lungs, each exhale a silent prayer to the Emperor that I would endure. My hands itched beneath the ceramite gloves, a subtle tension that mirrored the unrest in my mind. The corridors were littered with remnants of devotion and defeat, shattered candles, scorched banners, fractured icons. Each fragment whispered its history, a litany of valor and futility that pressed into my consciousness, leaving me both awed and hollow. The fortress was alive in its ruin, breathing through the cracks and fractures, speaking in creaks and groans, and I felt its weight in the marrow of my bones. I moved slowly, aware of every step, every echo. My thoughts circled like carrion birds, feeding on the debris of memory. Brother Varus, fallen. Brother Kale, missing. Countless others, names fading into the ash. The vigil demanded my attention, yet my mind struggled to focus. tugged between ritual and the insidious pull of despair. I whispered the creed of vigilance aloud, letting its cadence shape my breathing. Yet even as I spoke, the doubts pressed in. Was this persistence meaningful, or a hollow defiance against the inevitable? Ritual offered structure, but it could not shield the mind from the gnawing awareness that we were dying, chapter by chapter, brother by brother. A distant metallic clang reverberated through the hall, unnatural in its rhythm, irregular, deliberate. My bolter rested heavily on my shoulder, the cold steel grounding me even as the shadows around me shifted unnaturally. I inhaled the acrid air, tasting metal and ozone, letting it anchor my thoughts in the present. Something lurked beyond perception, subtle and patient. It was not the enemy, not yet, but the pressing hint of forces older, slower, and insidious. I clenched my fists, repeating a prayer, letting ritual guide my focus. Yet part of me recognized the precariousness of my own conviction. Faith was necessary, but fragile. The vigil demanded endurance, yes, but also clarity, and clarity was in short supply. I paused in a chamber where the remnants of a shrine had survived the bombardment. Candles, half-burned, flickered with stubborn defiance, casting long, distorted shadows that crept like living things along the walls. I knelt and traced the etchings on the stone, sigils worn and cracked but still potent. The weight of my predecessors pressed upon me, urging me to continue, demanding that I honor their sacrifices. I whispered their names aloud, letting the syllables roll across my tongue, tasting ash and iron with every repetition. And yet, the act brought no comfort, only the bitter clarity that even ritual and memory could not stave off the creeping inevitability of collapse. A shiver ran down my spine as I sensed the first whispers of corruption, subtle and almost imperceptible, curling in the corners of perception like smoke from a hidden flame. I inhaled sharply, tasting the faint sweetness of something unnatural in the air. It was not chaos in its full manifestation, but the whisper of it, a seduction threaded into the very fabric of the fortress. My mind recoiled, aware of the danger, yet fascinated by the awareness. Doubt and fear intertwined, a delicate dance of instinct and contemplation. I reminded myself of the oaths I had sworn, the vigil I had accepted, the sacred duty to endure, and yet a part of me wondered whether endurance alone was enough. I moved deeper into the labyrinthine halls, the shadows thickening, swallowing my reflection until I was a silhouette against the faint light of scattered candles. The walls bore the scars of desperate combat, claw marks, scorched lines, shattered stone. I traced them absent-mindedly, my mind cycling through memories of brothers and battles, victories and failures, and the slow realization that our chapter's story was dwindling, fading. Ritual became my tether, repetition my anchor, but the weight of inevitability pressed harder with each breath. I wondered whether the fortress itself mourned, exhaling grief through the cracks and fractures, whispering that nothing would remain beyond the vigil. Footsteps echoed faintly behind me, deliberate and measured. I knew it was another brother, perhaps scouting or patrolling, though the emptiness amplified the sound until it became a chorus of judgment. I whispered a short prayer, asking for vigilance, clarity, endurance. The words seemed to cling to the walls, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive silence. I pressed on, aware of every detail, the texture of stone beneath my fingertips, the taste of smoke in the air, the tremor in my gauntlets as I gripped my weapon. The fortress was a crucible, testing not only flesh and ceramite but mind and spirit, and I was acutely aware of my own fragility. I came to a collapsed corridor, the rubble forming jagged obstacles, the shadows pooling unnaturally in crevices. I paused, inhaling the metallic scent of iron and ash, and felt the first true weight of hesitation. My mind, trained in obedience and ritual, fought the subtle urge to stop, to question, to consider surrender. But ritual demanded motion, discipline required action, faith required endurance. I climbed over the rubble, each handhold and foothold deliberate, feeling the strain in muscles long accustomed to battle. The shadows twisted, almost sentient, and I whispered aloud, a ritual litany, a counterpoint to the insidious influence pressing on the edges of my perception. Finally, I reached an antechamber that had survived the bombardment, its walls lined with faintly glowing runes and the remnants of holy icons. I knelt before the altar, letting the ritual wash over me, grounding me against the encroaching dread. My hands traced the familiar patterns, each motion a defiance of despair, each gesture a reaffirmation of duty. And yet, even as I recited the creed of vigilance, I sensed the subtle tendrils of corruption pressing at the edges of the chamber, a quiet challenge to endurance and faith alike. I drew a steadying breath, tasting the bitter tang of iron and ash, and whispered to the silence, "The vigil continues, even as doubt creeps, even as shadows stretch." I rose, bolter in hand, knowing that the path forward demanded more than ritual. It demanded confrontation with the growing darkness within and without. The ash lay thick across the floors, a fine powder that coated boots and armor alike. Each step I took stirred it into the stagnant air, a muted swirl that caught the dim light and made the shadows tremble. The smell was pervasive: iron, smoke, and the faint, unsettling hint of something sweeter, sickly, and unnatural. My gauntlets brushed against fractured stone as I moved, feeling every rough edge, every scar etched into the walls by centuries of siege and devotion. The fortress breathed around me, slow and deliberate, each creak and groan a whisper of memory, warning, and expectation. I inhaled deeply, tasting the bitter tang of decay, letting it anchor me even as unease coiled in my chest. I paused beneath a collapsed archway, the remains of sacred banners draped across jagged stone. The colors had long since faded, but the symbols remained, etched into cloth and stone alike, defiant against entropy. I reached out, letting fingers brush against frayed threads and chipped paint. Ritual demanded recognition of these remnants, acknowledgement of sacrifice and faith. And yet, doubt pressed in, subtle as a shadow. Was this act of preservation an assertion of devotion or an admission of our impotence? I whispered a prayer, letting the syllables guide my heartbeat, but the answer was not forthcoming. The shadows seemed to pulse in the dim light, as though aware of the hesitation in my mind. A sudden clatter echoed from deeper within the halls, distant yet resonant. My bolter felt heavy in my hands, a comforting weight in a world where certainty was scarce. I shifted my gaze, peering into darkness where angles and recesses conspired to obscure what lay ahead. The fortress itself seemed alive in its ruin, responding to my presence with subtle shifts of shadow and sound. I whispered the creed of vigilance under my breath, each word a tether against the rising tide of unease. The ash stirred around me, catching in the folds of my armor, the remnants of prayer and incense mingling with the scent of iron and ruin. Every step was deliberate, conscious of both physical and psychological terrain. I entered a chamber that had once served as a meditation hall. The floor was cracked, and statues of angels bore chips and gouges from bombardment, their faces half eroded into grief. I ran a hand along the base of one, feeling the cold stone beneath my fingertips. The ritual of touch, of recognition, of respect, grounded me even as fear and doubt wormed their way into my consciousness. I could hear my own heartbeat, a rhythm that demanded repetition, constancy, perseverance. I whispered aloud fragments of the litany of endurance, letting the words form a shield against the encroaching dread. Yet the air carried something else, subtle, intangible, a pressure that seemed to press not only upon my body but into my mind, probing the boundaries of discipline and reason. The shadows shifted unnaturally, curling along the walls like smoke carried on an unseen wind. I felt the first tendrils of doubt seep through the cracks of ritual, whispering of futility and surrender. I clenched my fists, bolter in hand, grounding myself in touch, sound, and scent, the tactile reality of ceramite and steel. I reminded myself that ritual was not merely recitation, but action, that faith demanded not only words but persistence, endurance, and recognition of the void around us. Each echo, each tremor in the stone, reinforced the necessity of movement, of vigilance, of recognition that our chapter's legacy depended not solely on survival, but on the steadfastness of the spirit. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur brushed at the edges of perception. The air carried a note of sweetness, subtle and intoxicating, like a fragrance left behind by some unseen hand. I inhaled, tasting ash and iron and the faint corruption that lingered in the shadows. My mind recoiled even as curiosity pressed forward. Was this the enemy, or the first whisper of forces older and subtler, threading their presence through the fortress itself? I recited prayers under my breath, letting cadence and rhythm guide my focus. The fortress responded with a groan, subtle but insistent, a warning that the path ahead would test not only endurance but the integrity of mind and spirit. I descended a narrow stairwell, the walls blackened with smoke and soot, the steps slick with ash. Every handhold and foothold demanded attention, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. The fortress seemed to compress around me, the shadows thickening into something almost tangible. I paused, tracing the etched sigils along the walls, reminders of generations who had walked this path before me. Their presence offered both comfort and accusation. We endure, yet for how long? The question lingered unspoken, echoing louder in the silence of the ruined halls. I repeated the creed of vigilance, letting its cadence fill the void, and pressed onward, each step a statement of defiance against despair. Finally, I entered an antechamber illuminated by a single, stubborn flame. The light flickered across fractured walls and shattered relics, casting grotesque, elongated shadows. I knelt, letting the ritual wash over me, tracing the outlines of sigils and etchings with gloved fingers. The ash whispered beneath my hands, a reminder of mortality, decay, and the passage of time. My mind wrestled with the encroaching uncertainty, yet ritual anchored me, even as doubt gnawed at the edges. I rose, bolter in hand, tasting ash and iron with deliberate inhalation, and whispered a vow. The vigil endures, even as shadows stretch, even as corruption breathes in the hidden corners. With measured steps, I advanced into the darkness beyond, the fortress pressing its weight into my soul, the path forward both perilous and inevitable. The corridors twisted like veins through the fortress, and I felt as though the stones themselves conspired to test my endurance. The smell of scorched metal and ash was omnipresent, a relentless reminder of the carnage that had passed and the decay that lingered. My boots scuffed over fractured masonry, each step resonating in hollow chambers that had once echoed with prayers and hymns. Now the silence was absolute, punctuated only by distant groans of stress in the structure and the occasional hiss of escaping gas from ruptured conduits. Lights struggled through shattered lumens, flickering across walls blackened with soot, and shadows pooled with an almost sentient patience, waiting for hesitation, for weakness. I traced my hands along the rough edges of a collapsed wall, feeling the coarse texture bite beneath ceramite. Ritual demanded recognition of these scars, acknowledgement that the fortress itself had borne witness to countless battles, countless acts of devotion. Yet I could not quell the insidious whisper threading through my mind. What purpose remained in persistence, when the end was inevitable and the enemy tireless? I muttered a prayer, letting the syllables flow mechanically, but they felt hollow against the weight pressing into my chest. Faith demanded action, yet I found myself questioning whether endurance alone was enough to honor those who had fallen. From deeper within the hallways, a faint metallic scraping sounded. My grip on the bolter tightened. Shadows shifted unnaturally at the periphery of perception, coiling and twisting in ways that defied geometry. I inhaled the acrid air, tasting iron, ash, and something subtly sweet that did not belong. A corruption, faint but present, threaded the fortress like a hidden current, teasing my mind with its presence. Ritual had always been my anchor, yet now I felt the first tremors of internal fracture. Was vigilance sufficient to withstand this? Or was I merely preparing myself to follow the chapter into a slow, inevitable dissolution? I paused before a shattered reliquary, kneeling to brush away debris and ash. Faded etchings of prayers and chapter insignias remained, telling the story of our legacy in worn, imperfect lines. I whispered aloud the names of brothers fallen here, tracing the letters with gloved fingertips. The act of remembrance grounded me, yet the weight of mortality pressed hard. Each name carried the echo of blood, sacrifice, and silence. And with every echo came a question. What is faith when survival is uncertain and purpose is defined by repetition rather than triumph? The fortress seemed to murmur in response, a low vibration that rattled ceramite and bone alike. I pressed onward into the lower sanctum, where temperatures dropped and shadows deepened unnaturally. Every surface was blackened, scarred, or etched with desperate symbols of devotion. I ran my hands over carved glyphs, the texture rough under ceramite, and whispered the litany of endurance. My voice echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive stillness. The fortress was a crucible, testing both body and spirit, and I felt the strain of endless vigilance pressing into the marrow of my bones. Even as ritual provided structure, the subtle presence of something alien in the air, a whisper threading between words, made my teeth ache with tension. A tremor shivered through the hall, dust and ash cascading from fractured arches. I adjusted my stance, bolter ready, scanning the shifting shadows for any sign of movement. The fortress groaned in response, as though acknowledging my vigilance while mocking its futility. I inhaled deeply, tasting metal and ash, and felt the weight of tradition and duty pressing against the fragile boundaries of mind. My reflection flickered against a shard of mirrored ceramite embedded in the wall, eyes hardened by battle, yet haunted by doubt. The question repeated silently. How long could faith endure when every step forward was measured in loss? I entered a chamber partially intact, the remnants of a chapel surviving the bombardment. Candles sputtered faintly along the altar, their flames defiant yet fragile against the pervasive darkness. I knelt, hands tracing familiar patterns in the stone, feeling the vibrations of ancient prayers beneath my touch. The ritual provided order, anchoring my spirit in the chaos, yet the subtle taint of corruption lingered at the edges, pressing insistently against perception. Shadows shifted, forming shapes almost human, almost alive, and I whispered a prayer not just for strength, but for clarity, for the ability to endure without succumbing to the gnawing doubt. Footsteps echoed behind me. I knew it was another brother, patrolling or seeking guidance, though the corridor's emptiness amplified the sound into an unnatural resonance. I responded with the cadence of the creed of vigilance, letting the words flow through me like a shield. The shadows seemed to recoil at the ritual's rhythm, yet something remained. A lingering pressure, subtle but undeniable, reminding me that the fortress was more than stone and steel. It was a crucible for faith, a test of endurance, and perhaps a mirror of the fragility that resided in the mind itself. Finally, I rose and advanced deeper into the sanctum. The corridors narrowed, shadows thickening, the oppressive weight of silence and ash pressing around me. I tasted iron and ash with each deliberate inhalation, letting the physical sensations anchor me even as the mind strained against insidious whispers. I whispered under my breath, "The vigil endures, even as doubt gnaws, even as corruption lingers in the hidden corners." Each step forward was an act of defiance, a choice to persist in faith despite the fracturing of certainty. The fortress seemed to press inward, challenging every ounce of discipline. Yet I pressed on, bolter in hand, guided by ritual and conscience, moving toward an uncertain horizon where shadows promised both revelation and peril. The corridors twisted and narrowed, each turn swallowing more light and exhaling a heavier scent of ash and decay. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing against ceramite and flesh alike, carrying whispers that threaded through my mind like fine steel wire. Each echo was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet insistent, tugging at memory and doubt. I inhaled, tasting iron and the faint, sweet tang of corruption hidden beneath centuries of incense and devotion. Shadows pooled unnaturally, curling in corners and niches, and for a fleeting moment, I questioned whether they were merely absence of light or something deliberate, conscious. Every instinct screamed caution, yet ritual compelled me onward, each step measured, each gesture deliberate, a tether against the encroaching uncertainty. I ran my fingers along the jagged masonry, the coarse texture biting faintly beneath ceramite. Etched sigils and faded inscriptions marked the devotion of generations, reminders of brothers whose lives had been spent in unyielding service. I whispered their names aloud, letting cadence form a fragile shield against the gnawing unease. And yet, even as I recited, a subtle pressure crept into my consciousness, a whisper of doubt, of futility, questioning the purpose of endurance. The fortress seemed to pulse with awareness, responding not to motion or sound, but to thought, to hesitation. I closed my eyes briefly, letting ritual guide my breath, tracing the familiar rhythm of prayer, the cadence of discipline, trying to anchor my mind against the insidious pull of the unseen. A distant clatter echoed through a fractured archway, metallic and irregular, carrying a resonance that felt almost sentient. I adjusted the bolter across my shoulder, the steel a cold reassurance beneath my hands. The shadow at the periphery of vision shifted, coiling in ways that defied logic. I tasted ash and iron, letting the sensory detail ground me, but the whispering walls persisted, threading questions through memory and devotion. Was the vigil an act of faith or a mask for fear? Was ritual a tool to protect or a prison that bound the mind to repetition? I inhaled, each breath a conscious effort, feeling the chill seep through ceramite into bone, letting physical awareness fight back against mental erosion. I moved into a chamber partially intact, its floor scarred by desperate combat. Shattered statues of angels leaned against walls blackened by fire, faces eroded into expressions of grief or accusation. I traced a hand along the stone, feeling the coarse grooves beneath gloves, whispering fragments of liturgy to stabilize my mind. The act was mechanical, yet sacred, grounding me even as doubt pressed its insidious fingers into thought. The whispers coalesced here, subtle threads of suggestion, surrender, patience, release. I shook my head, whispering an oath to the Emperor, to the Omnicia, to whatever power preserved faith against the void. Ritual was a weapon, bolter and creed alike, and I steeled myself, repeating gestures with deliberate precision, reinforcing the boundaries of sanity with every motion. The temperature dropped further as I advanced through a narrow passage. Frost clung to the walls, and each breath condensed in misty plumes, tasting bitter with ash and iron. Shadows writhed in peripheral vision, suggesting movement, yet when observed directly, they were only absence. I gritted teeth and pressed onward, aware that hesitation was a luxury I could not afford. The fortress seemed to test the limits of both endurance and perception, its walls murmuring truths and half-truths that gnawed at reason. I whispered under my breath, a mantra of vigilance and defiance, letting cadence and rhythm serve as armor against encroaching uncertainty. Each step forward was a conscious defiance of both fear and temptation. A tremor ran beneath my boots, subtle but insistent. Dust cascaded from fractured arches, settling on relics and candles alike, and the whispering intensified. I glanced at the shattered remains of a chapel along the corridor, faint light from a stubborn flame casting grotesque shapes across the walls. I knelt briefly, tracing the outline of an etched sigil, feeling the coarse stone bite beneath gloved fingers. The ritual, familiar and mechanical, provided fleeting clarity, a fragile tether against the pervasive unease. Yet even as I rose, the whispers pressed closer, a chorus threading between the prayers, hinting at unseen presences and malign intelligence. The fortress was alive, patient and observant, and I could not deny that the vigil demanded more than action. It demanded confrontation with shadows both real and imagined. I continued through winding passages, noting the remnants of devotion amidst ruin. Faded banners, blackened statues, and scorched floors whispered stories of valor, sacrifice, and impermanence. Each memory pressed against my consciousness, echoing the duality of persistence and futility. I inhaled the bitter tang of ash and iron once more, letting the ritual gestures guide hands and mind, anchoring me against the insidious pull of doubt. The shadows shifted again, curling and stretching like liquid smoke, and I whispered a vow. The vigil endures, even as walls whisper, even as the fortress itself tests both spirit and flesh. Bolter in hand, I advanced, deliberate and measured, aware that each step deeper carried the weight of history, faith, and the unseen forces pressing at the edges of perception. At the chamber's threshold, I paused, inhaling the chill, tasting ash and metal, feeling the oppressive silence thrum in resonance with my heartbeat. Shadows pooled, reluctant to yield to light, and the fortress itself seemed to hold its breath. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting rhythm and repetition steel the mind against seduction and despair. With measured steps, I moved forward into the darkness beyond, bolter ready, senses sharpened, each movement a conscious act of defiance. The walls whispered still, patient and unyielding, yet I pressed onward, guided by ritual, faith, and the fragile persistence that defined the vigil. The ash lay in thick, unbroken layers, muffling footsteps and swallowing sound like a living shroud. Each inhale carried the taste of iron and burnt wood, the familiar sting of smoke that clung to nostrils and throat. My ceramite plates creaked faintly as I moved, the subtle vibrations a reminder that even the fortress itself responded to the weight of existence. Shadows gathered in corners and recesses, darkened pools that twisted unnaturally in the weak lumens scattered across fractured walls. Every step was deliberate, a negotiation with both the terrain and the mind, which whispered questions I could not entirely silence. Persistence demanded vigilance, but the mind ached for respite, and I felt the first tremors of exhaustion pressing like a physical weight. I paused before a half-collapsed archway, hands brushing against cold stone. Etched into the masonry were sigils of the chapter, worn by age and siege, but still potent, silent sentinels of memory and duty. I traced the grooves with gloved fingers, whispering fragments of prayers long learned and barely understood. The ritual was more than repetition. It was a lifeline, a tether connecting past and present, spirit and body. And yet, the weight of inevitability pressed in, brothers fallen, corridors crumbled, and enemies unseen yet unrelenting. Each gesture, each syllable, each careful step was both defiance and acknowledgement. Faith demanded endurance, yet endurance demanded clarity, and the mind teetered on the edge of collapse. A distant metallic echo reverberated through the halls, irregular and deliberate. Instinct sharpened every sense, and I adjusted my grip on the bolter, letting the familiar cold of steel remind me of the tangible, the controllable. Shadows shifted again, coiling like smoke around memory and thought, threading through perception with deliberate patience. I inhaled the acrid air, tasting iron and ash and something else beneath, a sweetness that did not belong. Subtle, insidious, it teased the mind with questions of purpose and inevitability. Ritual anchored me, each recited word, each repeated gesture a barrier against intrusion, but the fortress itself seemed patient, waiting for hesitation, listening for doubt. I descended a stairwell blackened by fire, the steps uneven, slick with ash. Frost clung to the walls, biting through ceramite, reminding me of the physical reality beneath the abstract pressure of thought. I moved deliberately, feeling each foothold and handhold, noting every detail, the texture of stone, the angle of shadows, the faint hum of unseen engines, or perhaps machinery long abandoned. The fortress pressed against the mind as surely as it pressed against the body, and every instinct screamed caution. Yet ritual demanded motion, faith demanded recognition, and I pressed onward, repeating the creed of vigilance to steady breath and heartbeat alike. I entered a chamber partially intact, a shrine of scorched stone and fractured icons. Candles clung stubbornly to flickering flames, casting long, grotesque shadows across jagged walls. I knelt, tracing sigils and etchings with gloved hands, whispering prayers under my breath. The ritual offered clarity and stability, yet the subtle taint of corruption pressed at the edges of perception, weaving questions of purpose and futility into thought. The shadows shifted unnaturally, curling and stretching in ways that defied comprehension, as if testing the limits of endurance. I felt the pressure on mind and spirit intensify, and I whispered a vow. The vigil endures, even when doubt gnaws, even when corruption whispers at the edges of perception. A faint shudder passed through the hall, and dust cascaded from fractured ceilings. I inhaled sharply, tasting ash and iron, feeling the chill penetrate ceramite into bone. The fortress seemed to breathe with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a pulse that matched the beating of my own heart. reminding me that the vigil demanded not only endurance but awareness. Ritual gestures became deliberate, every motion an act of defiance against the insidious, unseen forces threading the air. The bolter was heavy and real, the steel a tangible anchor amid intangible pressure, a counterpoint to whispering walls and shifting shadows. Footsteps echoed faintly behind me, deliberate, careful, as if aware of hesitation. I responded with low recitation of the litany of endurance, letting rhythm and cadence carve a path through uncertainty, reinforcing boundaries of discipline against the growing tension. Shadows recoiled slightly, yet the pressure persisted, subtle and pervasive. I tasted the metallic tang of ash and blood, felt the vibration of stone beneath ceramite, and let ritual, memory, and duty guide each step. Even as the fortress tested body and spirit alike, I pressed onward, conscious of every detail, every shadow, every heartbeat, aware that persistence alone was both weapon and shield. I reached a narrowing corridor where light struggled to penetrate, shadows pooling thickly along walls scarred with fire and claw marks. I paused, inhaling, tasting ash and iron, feeling the oppressive weight settle into chest and limbs. The fortress whispered, patient and deliberate, its presence pressing on mind and body alike. I whispered under my breath, "The vigil continues, even as shadows stretch, even as corruption seeps unseen." Bolter in hand, senses sharpened, I advanced further into darkness, knowing that endurance alone would not suffice. Discipline, faith, and ritual would be tested anew, and every step deeper carried the weight of history, the burden of duty, and the looming inevitability that framed our vigil. The air grew colder still, carrying the metallic tang of iron and the bitter scent of ash. Each breath tasted of decay and exhaustion, a reminder that the fortress itself had absorbed centuries of battle and suffering. My boots scuffed across fractured stone floors, stirring clouds of fine dust that clung to armor and lingered in the stagnant air. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls, coiling in corners and niches, as if the dark had grown sentient, pressing into the mind with quiet insistence. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighted not only by ceramite and bolter, but by the slow, grinding accumulation of memory, loss, and expectation. I traced a hand along the jagged edges of a collapsed archway, feeling the rough texture beneath my gloves. Faded sigils of the chapter, etched by hands long silenced, reminded me of our persistence, our ritual, our duty. Yet the subtle pressure of inevitability gnawed at thought, threading doubt through even the most disciplined gestures. I whispered prayers aloud, letting the cadence carve a protective rhythm through my consciousness. Yet even ritual could not erase the creeping tension that wrapped around mind and bone alike. The vigil demanded endurance, but endurance required clarity, and clarity felt increasingly elusive. A distant metallic scrape echoed through the corridors, irregular and deliberate. My bolter rested heavily across my shoulder, its steel cool and grounding beneath gloved hands. Shadows shifted at the edges of perception, twisting unnaturally, testing the limits of vigilance. I inhaled the acrid air, tasting ash, iron, and a subtle sweetness that was wrong, alien, pressing against reason. My mind recoiled even as instinct and training urged focus. Ritual gestures became deliberate shields against the gnawing uncertainty, each syllable of the creed of vigilance a barrier against intrusion. The fortress itself seemed patient, waiting for hesitation, listening for cracks in discipline and faith. I descended a stairwell blackened by fire, the steps slick with ash and frost, the air growing colder with every footfall. Hands gripped uneven railings, fingers searching for purchase in stone scarred by centuries of siege and devotion. The shadows deepened, curling along walls like smoke, and the fortress seemed to pulse with a slow, deliberate awareness. Every motion required conscious thought, every breath deliberate, each inhalation a negotiation with both body and mind. Doubt whispered between the steps, weaving questions of purpose, endurance, and the fragile balance between faith and fear. I entered a chamber partially intact, its floor scarred by desperate combat and desecration. Shattered statues of angels leaned against walls blackened by fire, their faces eroded into grief and accusation. I knelt, tracing etched sigils and lines with gloved fingers, reciting liturgies in a rhythm that tethered thought and spirit to ritual. Yet even here, subtle corruption pressed at perception's edge, whispering temptation, urging consideration of surrender. I clenched teeth and bolter alike, grounding myself in both physical reality and ceremonial action, repeating prayers with deliberate cadence, each word a small defiance against the encroaching darkness. The temperature dropped further as I advanced through narrowing passages. Frost clung stubbornly to walls and debris, biting through ceramite into muscle. Shadows writhed in peripheral vision, suggesting movement where none existed, pressing on perception with deliberate patience. Each step forward was a negotiation with instinct, with doubt, with the insidious suggestion that endurance itself might be futile. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance under my breath, letting rhythm and repetition fortify resolve, anchor consciousness, and stave off the subtle corrosion of will. A tremor ran beneath my boots, faint yet insistent, stirring dust from fractured arches. The fortress groaned in response, resonating with the weight of history, of memory, of relentless decay. I inhaled the bitter air, tasting iron and ash, feeling the oppressive weight settle into chest and limbs. Shadows twisted along walls and pillars, curling into forms that suggested both observation and judgment. I whispered a vow to the Emperor, to the Omnicia, to whatever force preserved faith in the void. The vigil continues, even as shadows stretch, even as corruption presses. I pressed deeper into the corridors, noting the remnants of devotion among ruin, faded banners, scorched statues, shattered altars. Each element of the fortress spoke of endurance and loss, of perseverance tested and faltering. I traced them with gloved hands, tasting ash and metal, letting ritual gesture and prayer tether mind and spirit against encroaching despair. The fortress seemed alive, patient and deliberate, observing every heartbeat, every breath, every step. I whispered under my breath, each movement is defiance, each gesture is acknowledgement, each prayer is persistence. Bolter in hand, senses sharpened, I moved forward, aware that the path ahead demanded discipline, vigilance, and the fragile courage that defined the vigil itself. At the threshold of the next chamber, I paused, inhaling the cold, tasting iron and ash, and letting ritual wash over tense muscles and frayed nerves. Shadows pooled thickly in the corners, reluctant to yield to failing light, yet I pressed onward. Each step deeper was measured, deliberate, a conscious act of defiance against the insidious weight of doubt and the creeping inevitability of decay. I whispered the litany of vigilance once more, letting rhythm and cadence carve a path through uncertainty, and advanced into darkness, bolter ready, senses alert, knowing that endurance alone would not suffice. The fortress pressed against mind and spirit alike, yet I moved forward, guided by faith, ritual, and the persistent, fragile flame of resolve. The corridors narrowed, walls slick with ash and condensation, as if the fortress itself exhaled a slow, deliberate breath. Each step reverberated through the fractured stone, carrying echoes of battles long ended and prayers left unanswered. Shadows pooled unnaturally in every crevice, thickened by the faint lumens struggling against darkness, and I felt their weight pressing into my mind as much as my body. The cold clung to ceramite, frost etching fine lines into armor and skin beneath, each breath tasting bitter with iron and ash. The fortress breathed in tandem with me, patient, sentient, its veins pulsing with the memory of countless souls, its heartbeat a slow, unyielding drum against my own. I ran my gloved hands along fractured masonry, feeling the jagged relief of etchings worn by centuries. Sigils and prayers carved into stone whispered of devotion, sacrifice, and loss, and I repeated them under my breath, letting rhythm anchor thought against creeping uncertainty. And yet the shadows pressed closer, teasing with movement at the edges of vision, curling and twisting as though aware of hesitation. Doubt threaded through mind and ritual alike. What value did endurance hold when every corridor, every stone, bore witness to the slow erosion of faith, flesh, and purpose. I clenched my fists, repeating oaths aloud, tasting the metallic tang of ash and iron, letting ritual stabilize body and spirit. A distant scraping echoed down the hall, metallic and uneven, hinting at movement unseen. Instinct sharpened every sense. My bolter was heavy across my shoulder, a tangible reassurance against the intangible. Shadows shifted at the periphery, coiling like smoke, probing the limits of focus. The fortress was patient, its presence deliberate, its awareness subtle yet insistent. Every motion, every syllable of prayer, every gesture became a measure against encroaching influence. The litany of endurance flowed from my lips, a tether against both uncertainty and the subtle tendrils of corruption pressing at perception. I descended into a narrow stairwell, walls blackened with soot and frost, each step slippery with ash. My hands gripped uneven stone, bolstered by ceramite, feeling every jagged edge and coarse surface. Shadows pooled and stretched unnaturally, whispering questions I was trained not to answer, testing my endurance, my faith, my clarity. Each conscious step through frost, ash, and darkness was both ritual and assertion, a reaffirmation that the vigil demanded more than presence. It demanded attention, discipline, and recognition of the void pressing in on all sides. I entered a chamber where remnants of devotion survived amidst ruin. Fractured statues leaned against scorched walls, candles flickered against the persistent dark, and altars bore the scars of desperate combat. I knelt, tracing sigils and etchings with gloved fingers, whispering fragments of the creed of vigilance. The ritual anchored me, yet the shadows twisted unnaturally, forming shapes that teased the mind with the suggestion of intent. Doubt gnawed, subtle yet persistent, pressing on every corner of thought. I whispered to the unseen, invoking the Emperor and the Omnisia, letting rhythm and cadence form a fragile barrier against the insidious presence threading the air. A tremor ran through the chamber, dust cascading from cracked stone. I inhaled sharply, tasting ash, iron, and a subtle, alien sweetness beneath. The fortress seemed alive, not in the machinery or stone, but in the pressure it exerted on thought, memory, and ritual. Shadows shifted at the edge of perception, curling and writhing, testing vigilance as a predator might test prey. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting cadence and repetition carve a path through doubt, fortifying mind against intrusion. Every gesture, every syllable, every deliberate step became a measure of defiance, an assertion that persistence remained possible even as the shadows tested me. I advanced through the corridors, noting remnants of chapter history, scorched banners, blackened statues, shattered altars. Each artifact whispered both endurance and futility, memory and erosion. I traced them with deliberate attention, tasting ash and iron, feeling the cold bite through ceramite. Ritual offered structure, yet the fortress pressed against mind and spirit alike, testing limits, probing fractures, teasing with shadows and whispering walls. I whispered a vow under my breath. The vigil endures, even as corruption threads the air, even as shadows coil. Bolter ready, senses sharpened, I pressed forward, each step a conscious act of defiance against uncertainty, despair, and the malevolent weight pressing through stone and memory alike. At the threshold of a narrowing hall, I paused, inhaling the bitter air, tasting iron and ash, feeling the oppressive weight settle into chest and limbs. Shadows pooled, reluctant to yield to the faint lumens, yet I pressed onward. Each measured step deeper was a deliberate act of endurance, a conscious declaration of faith against the insidious pressure of doubt and corruption. The fortress breathed with me, testing body and mind, but I advanced, guided by ritual, duty, and the fragile persistence that defined the vigil, aware that the shadows held both revelation and peril in equal measure. The corridors grew tighter, suffocating, walls slick with soot and moisture, the air thick with ash and the metallic taste of iron. Every breath I drew carried both the scent of decay and the memory of countless battles, burned into stone and spirit alike. My boots scuffed across fractured floors, each step echoing faintly, swallowed almost immediately by shadows that seemed to pulse and coil like a living thing. Light struggled through broken lumens, flickering in rhythm with my heartbeat, casting grotesque shapes along walls scarred with fire, claw marks, and time. I felt the weight of centuries pressing against ceramite and bone, the fortress breathing slowly, deliberately, testing my endurance, my faith, and the integrity of ritual itself. I ran gloved fingers along fractured masonry, tracing etched sigils and faded prayers worn smooth by centuries of devotion. I whispered their names aloud, each syllable a tether against doubt pressing like a fist against my mind. Shadows pressed closer, curling and twisting, teasing perception, threading whispers of futility into thought. Was this vigilance merely repetition, an act of defiance, or a hollow acknowledgement of inevitable decay? The question lingered as I recited fragments of the Creed of Vigilance, letting cadence and ritual attempt to hold the mind together. Yet the insidious weight pressed harder, patient and deliberate. A faint metallic scrape echoed down the hall, irregular, deliberate, carrying resonance as if the stones themselves had teeth. Instinct sharpened, bolter across my shoulder a cold reassurance in the overwhelming uncertainty. Shadows shifted, curling unnaturally, pressing against the edges of perception, probing the limits of endurance. The fortress seemed aware, patient, testing not only body but mind. Each gesture, each repeated prayer, each measured step became both defiance and armor, a fragile barrier against encroaching entropy and malevolent intent. Ritual was not merely habit. It was survival, though survival now felt tenuous, stretched thin across memory, ash, and fear. I descended a narrow stairwell, steps slick with frost and ash, blackened from fire and time. My hands gripped uneven stone, fingers finding purchase against fractured edges, aware that even one slip could mean death or disorientation. Shadows writhed in peripheral vision, forming shapes that were almost human, almost alive, pressing on perception like a living test. Each deliberate step was a negotiation with fear, with doubt, with the subtle tendrils of chaos threading through the fortress like an invisible current. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting rhythm and repetition anchor mind and spirit, each syllable a declaration of persistence against the insidious pressure pressing on the soul. I entered a chamber partially intact, its floors scarred and blackened by desperate combat. Shattered statues leaned against walls, their faces eroded into expressions of grief, accusation, or despair. I knelt, tracing sigils and etched lines with gloved hands, reciting prayers to tether thought, body, and spirit. The ritual provided clarity, but the subtle presence of corruption pressed at the edges of perception, whispering suggestion, probing hesitation. Shadows twisted unnaturally, stretching toward the flickering candlelight, testing vigilance as predator tests prey. I felt the first real tremor of fracture in my resolve, the whispering pushing past ritual, probing memory and doubt with insidious patience. A shudder ran through the hall, dust cascading from fractured arches, the sound resonating against ceramite and bone alike. I inhaled sharply, tasting ash and iron, the subtle sweetness of corruption beneath, and forced my mind to anchor in ritual and discipline. Shadows writhed at the edges of perception, forming shapes both familiar and alien, testing the boundaries of endurance. I whispered a vow, invoking the Emperor, the Omnisia, and every force that had guided my faith. The vigil endures, even as the fortress presses, even as corruption coils. Bolter in hand, ritual repeating in cadence, I advanced deeper into darkness, each step deliberate, aware that persistence was both shield and weapon. The corridors narrowed further, light diminished, shadows pooling thickly along walls scarred by fire, claw marks, and time. I moved with heightened awareness, inhaling bitter air tasting of ash, iron, and the subtle tang of malevolence. The fortress seemed alive, patient, observing, weighing my steps against centuries of memory and loss. Ritual gestures provided order against the creeping dissonance, yet the whispers of doubt persisted, threading through thought with insidious subtlety. I whispered fragments of the Creed of Vigilance, anchoring body and mind to rhythm and cadence, asserting endurance despite the subtle fracture pressing into consciousness. At the threshold of a final, narrowing corridor, I paused. Cold seeped through ceramite into bone, shadows twisted in grotesque forms, and the fortress itself seemed to hold its breath. I tasted ash and iron, feeling the weight settle into chest and limbs. Each measured step deeper was an act of defiance, each gesture of ritual a fragile assertion of faith. I whispered a vow. The vigil endures, even as doubt gnaws, even as corruption coils unseen. Bolter ready, senses sharpened, I pressed onward into darkness, knowing that the true test lay ahead, where shadow and resolve would collide, and endurance would be measured against inevitability. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy and suffocating, laden with ash, soot, and the faint sweetness of something unnatural lurking beneath. Each inhalation burned the lungs, leaving a metallic tang that lingered, a persistent reminder of decay and ruin. Shadows pooled like liquid, stretching and writhing in corners and alcoves, curling around pillars and fractured walls as though alive. My boots scuffed across cracked stone, each echo swallowed almost immediately by oppressive silence, a silence that pressed against mind and ceramite alike. The fortress exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if testing the limits of endurance, weighing each breath, each heartbeat, each movement against centuries of memory and blood. I brushed gloved fingers along jagged masonry, tracing faded sigils and prayers worn smooth by devotion and time. Names of brothers long fallen whispered through memory, echoing in the hollow corridors with both reverence and accusation. I recited fragments of the Creed of Vigilance under my breath, letting rhythm and cadence anchor mind and spirit, but the subtle pull of doubt pressed like ice against the edges of consciousness. Shadows shifted, curling almost sentiently, threading through perception with the patience of predators. Ritual anchored me, yet I felt the first tremors of psychological fracture pressing through body and soul alike. A faint metallic scrape sounded ahead, irregular and deliberate, resonating through the stone floors and hollow walls. Instinct sharpened perception, bolter across my shoulder a cold reassurance in the oppressive void. Shadows twisted, probing edges of sight, testing vigilance as a predator tests prey. The fortress seemed patient, aware, deliberate, waiting for hesitation, listening for cracks in discipline and faith. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting repetition and rhythm fortify resolve against encroaching malevolence. Each gesture, each step, each breath became a conscious declaration of persistence against the insidious weight pressing on thought. I descended a stairwell slick with ash and frost, stone etched with centuries of wear. Hands gripped uneven edges, fingers aware of every minute detail, balancing on thresholds of safety and uncertainty. Shadows writhed unnaturally at the periphery, hinting at forms just beyond perception, pressing on mind and spirit with deliberate patience. Each conscious step was ritual, defiance, assertion, both survival and acknowledgement of fragility. I whispered prayers under my breath, cadence and repetition forming a fragile barrier against the insidious threads threading through thought and perception. I entered a chamber partially intact, the floor scarred with remnants of desperate combat. Shattered statues leaned against walls blackened by fire, their faces twisted into grief and accusation. I knelt, tracing etched sigils with gloved hands, whispering prayers as a tether against doubt. Shadows twisted toward flickering candlelight, testing vigilance and endurance. I felt the subtle fracture of resolve push at the edges of consciousness, the whispering pressing past ritual into memory and doubt. I clenched jaw and bolter alike, grounding myself in both physical reality and ceremonial action, repeating prayers with deliberate cadence, asserting persistence against the encroaching void. A tremor ran beneath boots and ceramite, dust cascading from fractured arches, the sound resonating deep in bone. I inhaled sharply, tasting ash and iron, the faint sweetness of corruption beneath. The fortress felt alive, testing body, mind, and spirit, a weight pressing into every motion. Shadows twisted at edges of vision, threatening to undo focus, yet ritual and cadence anchored thought. I whispered fragments of the Creed of Vigilance, carving a path through uncertainty, asserting endurance against insidious pressure. Each gesture, every deliberate step, became both shield and declaration, a fragile defiance against inevitability. I pressed forward through narrowing corridors, observing remnants of devotion among ruin, faded banners, blackened statues, shattered altars. Each artifact spoke of endurance and impermanence, memory and erosion. Gloved hands traced their surfaces, inhaling ash and iron, grounding mind and spirit in ritual. The fortress pressed against body and consciousness alike, testing limits, probing fractures, teasing with shadows and whispering walls. I whispered a vow. The vigil endures, even as shadows coil, even as corruption threads the air. Bolter in hand, senses sharpened, I advanced, aware that endurance alone would not suffice, and that the coming confrontation with shadow and silence would measure the strength of both faith and spirit. At the threshold of the final narrowing hall, I paused. Cold seeped through ceramite into bone. Shadows pooled thickly along scarred walls, reluctant to yield to failing lumens. Each measured step deeper was deliberate, a conscious assertion of persistence. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting cadence and repetition form a fragile barrier against despair and encroaching malevolence. Bolter ready, senses alert, I pressed forward into the darkness, knowing that the edge of silence would demand everything, and the fortress itself would weigh soul against shadow, faith against doubt, persistence against inevitability. The corridors narrowed to suffocating passages, walls slick with ash and frost, the air thick with the metallic tang of iron and the subtle, sweet rot of corruption. Each inhalation burned lungs and throat, tasting both decay and smoke, a reminder of centuries of blood and devotion entombed within stone. Shadows pooled thickly in corners, curling like living tendrils, and the faint lumens flickered against the jagged masonry, casting grotesque shapes that stretched and twisted unnaturally. Each step resonated across fractured floors, swallowed almost immediately by silence, pressing into both ceramite and mind with deliberate patience. The fortress exhaled slowly, its presence heavy and deliberate, testing endurance, faith, and the fragile cohesion of thought. I traced gloved fingers along the jagged edges of collapsed arches and walls, feeling etchings and faded sigils beneath fingertips. The names of fallen brothers whispered through memory, echoing with both reverence and accusation. I recited fragments of the Creed of Vigilance under breath, letting cadence and rhythm anchor thought against insidious doubt. Shadows pressed closer, curling and twisting with deliberate awareness, probing hesitation, threading suggestion of surrender into perception. Ritual anchored mind and body, yet the subtle fracture of resolve gnawed at the edges, testing discipline against the encroaching influence pressing from the depths. A distant metallic echo reverberated through the halls, irregular, deliberate, as if the stones themselves bore teeth. Instinct sharpened perception, Bolter resting cold and grounding across shoulder. Shadows writhed at periphery, probing limits of vigilance, patient and deliberate. Every gesture, every syllable of prayer, every measured step became both assertion and armor, a fragile defiance against entropy and malevolent intent. The litany of endurance flowed through lips and thought, anchoring mind to cadence, deflecting intrusion, even as the fortress pressed inward like an unyielding weight. I descended a stairwell slick with ash and frost, stone worn by centuries of passage. Hands gripped uneven edges, fingers acutely aware of every detail, balancing on thresholds of physical and mental safety. Shadows twisted unnaturally at edges of perception, hinting at forms just beyond vision, pressing on mind and spirit. Each step was both ritual and assertion, both survival and acknowledgement of fragility. Prayer under breath, repeated cadence, measured movement. These became shields against insidious pressure threading through air and thought alike. I entered a chamber partially intact, scarred by desperate combat, its floor littered with remnants of devotion and ruin. Shattered statues leaned against walls blackened by fire, faces twisted in grief and accusation. I knelt, tracing etched sigils with gloved fingers, whispering prayers as tethers against doubt. Shadows twisted toward flickering candlelight, testing vigilance and endurance. Fracture pressed at edges of consciousness, whispering past ritual into memory and fear. I clenched jaw and bolter, grounding in physical reality and ceremonial action, repeating prayers with deliberate cadence, asserting persistence against encroaching void. A tremor passed through stone beneath boots, dust cascading from fractured arches. I inhaled sharply, tasting ash, iron, and subtle alien sweetness. The fortress felt alive, patient, weighing body, mind, and spirit. Shadows twisted at edges of perception, threatening to undo focus, yet ritual anchored thought. Litany of vigilance carved path through doubt, every gesture deliberate, each step both shield and declaration, fragile defiance against inevitability. I pressed forward through narrowing corridors, observing remnants of chapter history, scorched banners, blackened statues, shattered altars. Each artifact spoke of endurance and impermanence, memory and erosion. Hands traced surfaces, inhaling ash and iron, grounding mind and spirit in ritual. Fortress pressed against body and consciousness alike, probing fractures, teasing with shadow and whisper. I whispered vow. The vigil endures, even as shadows coil, even as corruption threads the air. Bolter ready, senses sharpened, I advanced, aware that endurance alone would not suffice. At the threshold of the central chamber, I paused, cold seeping through ceramite into bone, shadows pooling thickly along scarred walls, reluctant to yield to weak lumens. Each step deeper was deliberate, conscious, assertion of persistence. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting cadence form fragile barrier against despair and encroaching malevolence. Bolter ready, senses alert, I advanced into the darkness where the fortress itself exhaled oblivion, testing the limits of faith, ritual, and the fragile persistence that defined the vigil. The air was thick with ash, metallic tang of iron, and a subtle sweetness that hinted at corruption, as if the fortress itself exhaled decay with every measured breath. Shadows pooled in impossible corners, stretching and twisting unnaturally, curling like sentient smoke that pressed against mind and ceramite alike. Light from fractured lumens flickered, casting grotesque patterns across walls scarred by centuries of siege, blood, and devotion. Each step I took reverberated in hollow corridors, echoing with centuries of memory and silent accusation. The weight of the fortress pressed into my chest, my limbs, my very consciousness, demanding endurance, demanding recognition of impermanence, yet insisting upon vigilance. I ran gloved fingers along fractured masonry, tracing faded sigils and carved prayers worn smooth by time and devotion. Names of brothers fallen whispered through memory, echoing with reverence and accusation alike. I recited fragments of the creed of vigilance under breath, letting cadence anchor thought against creeping uncertainty. Shadows pressed closer, coiling and twisting as if aware of hesitation, threading subtle suggestion into perception. Ritual tethered mind and body, yet the subtle fracture of resolve gnawed at the edges, pressing against every syllable, every gesture, every breath. A distant metallic scrape reverberated across fractured stone, irregular, deliberate, hinting at movement unseen. Instinct sharpened perception, bolter across shoulder a tangible reassurance in the oppressive void. Shadows writhed, probing the limits of vigilance, testing endurance as predator tests prey. The fortress felt alive, aware, deliberate, waiting for hesitation, for weakness, for the mind to falter. Litany of endurance flowed through lips and thought, rhythm carving a fragile path through doubt and insidious intrusion. Every movement, every syllable, every conscious step became both defiance and shield, asserting persistence against entropy and malevolent intent. I descended the narrow stairwell, hands gripping stone etched with centuries of wear. Steps slick with ash and frost demanded attention, awareness of each detail, balance against fracture. Shadows teased at perception, forming shapes that suggested presence, pressing on spirit and thought. Each conscious step became ritual, defiance, assertion, both survival and acknowledgement of fragility. Prayer under breath, repeated cadence, deliberate motion, shields against encroaching void, anchors against erosion of mind. I entered the central chamber, scarred by combat, remnants of devotion among ruin, shattered statues, scorched altars, blackened banners. I knelt, tracing etched sigils with gloved hands, whispering prayers to anchor mind and spirit. Shadows twisted toward flickering candlelight, testing vigilance, testing endurance. Fracture pressed at consciousness, whispering past ritual into memory and fear, yet I clenched jaw and bolter, grounding in physical and ceremonial action. Repetition, cadence, deliberate gesture became assertion, fragile defiance against encroaching oblivion. A tremor passed through stone beneath boots, dust cascading from fractured arches, resonating deep in bone. I inhaled, tasting ash and iron, subtle alien sweetness pressing against reason. The fortress felt alive, weighing body, mind, spirit. Shadows writhed at perception's edge, yet ritual anchored thought. Litany of vigilance carved path through doubt, every gesture deliberate, each step both shield and declaration, asserting fragile persistence against inevitability. I advanced through narrowing corridors, observing remnants of history, scorched banners, blackened statues, shattered altars. Each artifact whispered endurance and impermanence, memory and erosion. Hands traced surfaces, inhaling ash and iron, grounding body and mind in ritual. The fortress pressed against consciousness, probing fractures, teasing with shadow and whisper. I whispered vow. The vigil endures, even as corruption threads the air, even as shadows coil. Bolter ready, senses sharpened, I pressed onward, each step deliberate, knowing endurance alone would not suffice. At the threshold of the heart of the fortress, I paused. Cold seeped through ceramite into bone, shadows pooled thickly, reluctant to yield to failing lumens. Each measured step deeper was deliberate, conscious assertion of persistence. I whispered fragments of the litany of endurance, letting cadence form fragile barrier against despair and encroaching malevolence. Bolter ready, senses alert, I stepped forward into darkness where the fortress exhaled oblivion. Here, at the edge of mortality and faith, ritual and endurance fused, and the vigil transformed. Shadows, corruption, and memory pressed in, yet for the first time, I felt not fracture, but transcendence, an eternal ember of purpose burning within the void, the vigil no longer merely survival, but something eternal.